There are two well-funded organizations that are involved in the battle over the amendment. We talked with representatives from both groups opposing and supporting Amendment 2. United for Care sponsored the use of marijuana amendment, and Daniel Rogers, Legislative and Policy Director, spoke for the group. Opposing Amendment 2 is the Vote No on 2 coalition, and our guest is Policy Director Dr. Jessica Spencer. Each side was willing to take off the gloves for Capitol Dateline.
We cannot stop the other side from lying. And I think that for them, they've been crusading against marijuana for 20 plus years, maybe even 30 plus years.
We're looking at another loophole-riddled amendment that is not safe, and again, it's not good practice for the state of Florida.
There's also an ad war going on that's costing millions of dollars.
Voting yes on 2 will allow doctors to recommend the medicine they feel will ease the pain and suffering of thousands of sick Floridians. Yes on 2 allows medical marijuana use under the strict supervision of a doctor, only for debilitating conditions and diseases such as cancer and MS. 23 states now keep government and politicians out of the doctor-patient relationship, and it's worked. Vote yes on 2 and trust our doctors to do what's best.
This is a pharmacist. Qualifications: 4 years of medical training and 2,000 hours of clinical experience. This is a bud tender. Qualifications: no medical training, no clinical experience, but knows a lot about pot firsthand. With Amendment 2, pot will be legally dispensed by bud tenders, not pharmacists, in pot shops, not pharmacies. No prescription needed. That's not medicine. It's dope dealers with storefronts. Vote no on Amendment 2.
We asked our guest whom he believes would vote for the medical marijuana proposal.
It's a cross-section of society. You have a considerable amount of Republican support and Democratic support, so across parties, also crosses age lines. You have senior citizens that support it. A lot of them are on medications that perhaps leave them not living to the fullest quality of life, and they would have marijuana as an option available to them, and they've been generally supportive of that. Younger people are more supportive. They have more liberal attitudes toward medical marijuana than their parents may have had. You tend to see men also support it more than women.
Those opposing Amendment 2 believe the pro side is deceiving voters.
It's de facto legalization, period. You could read it once, it's only 2 pages, and come up with that conclusion yourself just by looking at it, because there are too many loopholes. It is too open, it is too broad. And again, if you aren't quite sure how to vote, you need to vote no just on that, because you're dealing with your state constitution. This isn't something, again, that we can go back to the legislature next year and say, can you please adjust this? You will be altering your state constitution. And it's important to remember that constitutional law will supersede all other law. And it's also very difficult to get back off the books.
At the heart of Amendment 2 is the question of who qualifies to get marijuana. To do so, you must have one of 10 debilitating medical conditions: cancer, epilepsy, glaucoma, HIV, AIDS, PTSD, ALS, Crohn's, Parkinson's disease, and MS, or other debilitating medical conditions of the same kind or class as or comparable to those enumerated. The opponents call the conditions misleading.
If this was seriously about debilitating conditions in individuals that are suffering at end of life, which no one wants to argue with, and no one would argue with. And quite frankly, when we look at the debilitating conditions, those are serious diseases. The problem with it is those are window dressings. Those look good on paper, and they're actually predatory. They prey on us as compassionate individuals and compassionate Floridians. But you keep going further in the language and realize that it's opened up for those other conditions.
Well, I think that there are a number of conditions that in the country that perhaps only 1,000 or so people suffer from, but marijuana has been seen to be helpful for those conditions. It's unrealistic for the legislature to come back every single year to add new conditions, to play doctor and decide who qualifies and who doesn't, especially if there's only a handful of people in the state who would apply under those conditions. If we leave it to the physician's discretion, as long as it's a debilitating and chronic condition and the known benefits outweigh the known risks, then I think that most people would agree that that's a reasonable approach to medical marijuana in determining who qualifies.
I think the problem is the words medical marijuana. You put those two together and people start to think that this is actually medicine, but what we're dealing with is marijuana, period. It's de facto legalization of pot. There are no studies, there are no medical communities that have come out and said, and no studies to show that pot helps with any conditions or alleviates or cures any conditions.
What do opponents think are the proposed amendment loopholes?
There's several. We had caregivers last time. They had a cap on the caregiver. You were only allowed to have 5 clients, patients, whatever you wanted to call them. There's no cap on those now. And we also have to remember that the caregiver is not medically trained. You know, this isn't a nurse. This isn't someone that is familiar with your particular disease process. You don't go to your local pharmacy. You go to your pot shop, which there will be upwards of 2,000. The other side openly admits they don't know how many. There could be 5,000 pot shops here in our state. And you see a bud tender that has no medical training, that has no pharmaceutical training. And again, we're not dealing with a medicine. We're dealing with nugs and dabbing and oils and edibles.
The supporters strongly disagree and believe the amendment's caretakers are essential to the administration of marijuana.
They can't function through a daily life without someone taking care of them, whether it be helping them bathe or helping them eat or get dressed, whatever may be the case. And the same thing is true with medication. In California, and I think a lot of people, when they think of caregivers, they think of the California model, where they acted basically as the marijuana businesses. They went out and they served X amount of patients. They were allowed to grow 6 plants per patient. That's not what the caregiver is in Florida. Caregiver in Florida is a single individual that cares for a person who's suffering from a debilitating condition. They go to the dispensary, they'll pick up their medication for them, and they'll help administer the medication. The opposition would like you to think those are drug dealers.
Opponents like to remind voters that the marijuana that will be used is highly potent.
We're not dealing with the pot of the 70s. This pot is 10 times more potent than what we saw in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. People need to understand that, especially when you think, oh, it's no problem and it's helping people. Is it? THC directly affects your brain. We are not dealing with the pot of the 60s and 70s. We're dealing with something completely different, and this amendment opens the door for that to happen.
With all the controversy surrounding the amendment, we asked Mr. Rogers how he would convince skeptics to support Amendment 2.
I would introduce them to patients who actually need it. It's one thing if I'm talking about, just letting people know there are people out there that need it. It's another thing if a voter meets a patient who actually needs it, where it could change their lives.
The opponents of Amendment 2 believe the other side is playing fast and loose with scientific facts.
We have to remember that our medicine goes through a strict, rigorous process. Scientific 21st century modern medicine to figure out the dosing, purity, standardization, contraindications. There are known and predictable side effects with our pharmaceuticals. We don't have that with pot at all. There's over 500 chemicals in this plant, and most of which affects your brain. So we're dealing with a substance that directly negatively affects the functioning of your brain and ability to make good judgments. So our belief system of how medicine should be, this is not it. And this amendment speaks precisely to that. This is allowing raw, crude herbal material. It's allowing edibles. This is not about the pursuit of science. This is not about the pursuit of medicine as true medicine. This is, again, de facto legalization of pot.
One argument that is consistently raised is the track record of California's medical marijuana rollout.
I think that if you compare Florida to California, that's like comparing apples to oranges. California, bless them, 1996, they were the first ones to pass a medical marijuana program. They were the pioneers in this field, but they served as an example of what not to do. When they passed their marijuana laws, they basically had a criminal defense mechanism at the state level. They didn't have any regulatory structure, so the regulations were all sent down to the local levels, and that's why California has all the problems they have.
It is a medical state, California is, very much similar to what we're looking at potentially here in our state. What people need to understand is when we're looking at the list of debilitating conditions that are on here, The states that have medical marijuana laws, only 3 to 5% of those individuals have them for such debilitating conditions. The other 95 to 97% of people that hold these medical marijuana cards have them for those other conditions. What's even more interesting is the average user is a 32-year-old white male with no history of a debilitating condition, but history of substance abuse. So again, when we go to such an amendment, which again, the de facto legalization piece, that because it allows the other conditions to be present, again, we are opening Pandora's box, we're opening a huge window for abuse, and we take away and detract from the actual issue of medicine and calling it a medicine, which it's not.
I don't see that as a concern for me, no, because they have to be Florida physicians, they have to be Florida residents, and they have to be given marijuana due to a debilitating chronic condition or one of the listed conditions are highlighted in the constitutional amendment. So I don't foresee us having a recreational program or anything that's a de facto recreational program under the guise of medical marijuana like what you would see in California. I don't envision that happening in Florida.